So good morning, everybody. My name is Rachel Parker. I'm the Director of AEV, and I'm delighted to welcome you all today to our panel on pilot events and looking at the delivery and impact that they've had over the last few months. I'm delighted to welcome Kerry Mulloy from ACC Liverpool, who's the Director of Events and Operations, who's going to talk to you specifically about the Good Business Festival and the other pilots that happened in Liverpool at the end of April, beginning of May. Octavia Harwood from the O2, who is Head of Event Management, is going to talk you through the BRIT Awards that happened at the beginning of May. And finally, Rob Brumell, who is the Head of Event Management from Farnborough International, is going to talk to you about hosting and running the production show under Step 3 guidance. We have had a number of questions already submitted, and I'm hoping that we will get more questions. So we'd ask you to put any questions in the chat. Actually, perhaps maybe I should just check with everybody. Can you all hear me? So maybe a couple of you could just put on the chat, yes, you can hear me. So just to check, which would be great. Yes, great. Thank you very much. So always a good one to double check. So yeah, I think without further ado, so all questions we'll do at the end of the three presentations. All three panelists are going to do a sort of 5 to 10 minute presentation, and then we'll go to questions afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kerry to the stage. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everybody. My name's Kerry Mulloy. As Rachel said, I work for ACC Liverpool. I'm Director of Events and Operations. I'm now going to go into the world of tech and try and share a screen, so bear with me. Right, that should be sharing. I'm just going to make it into a slideshow. Oh, God. Here we are. Right, there you are. I can't survive without my tech colleagues. So there you are. That's first step, first learning of the day. So just to start, I've got a quick few slides that I'll canter through. We were involved in the event research programme, pilot one with the ERP. Just to explain who was involved, there were many people involved in the ERP phase one for the Liverpool section of it, predominantly led by DCMS and the event research programme, but also a big player in this was the team led by Professor Ian Buchan from Liverpool University. And without Professor Ian Buchan, who you might have seen on many of the newsreels, he was a predominant feature of this and led from the university side of it, which was a really important piece of the research. Big player in the whole of the ERP for Liverpool was Liverpool City Council. Their co-joining with the DCMS and the government in general meant that as a pilot, we were an easy ask. It was an easy ask to co-join with Liverpool City Council. They'd already done a lot of work with the DCMS and the Department of Health and Social Care around the lateral flow testing programme that was set up in Liverpool in October of 2020. We were also co-joining with GraphNet, and we were obviously working with the Department of Health and Social Care. And a big player in making the ERP actually happen, and a big shout out was to the public health team in Liverpool, led by Matt Ashton, the Director of Public Health. So that's an overview of who was involved. Just to give you an idea of what the event pilot was actually aiming to achieve, it's really important because there's been some real misinformation out on social media about what it was meant to be doing. So it was to actually assess the risk of transmission of COVID by attending an outdoor or an indoor event. And the research programme was also to test and look at the characteristics of not only the events and the venues, but also the behaviours and how that can contribute to the transmission of COVID. That was a really important part about the behaviours, which I'll come on to. I thought it was important if I just pause here and just say what the actual ERP wasn't, because there'll be some of you who will be also aware, as people who are running events or running venues, that we all got caught up in a bit of bad publicity with regard to the pilot tests and the pilot programme. And it was unfair, and it was also from a very small minority. But personally, and as an organisation, we took a lot of hits on social media, and we also got personal emails and personal texts from people out there who were really opposed to what the ERP they thought was doing. People thought it was about us as a venue trying to test for the COVID passport, and it was absolutely nothing to do with that. So just there on the slide, you can see we were not testing a new way to deliver events. We were very clear about this. We said to the ERP, the DCMS, if you think that we are having to prove that we can run events, we're not getting involved. Everyone out there who runs a venue, you know, Octavia and Rob, who are on the panel, we can do events with our eyes closed. It's what we do. It's our bread and butter. We also don't need to prove that events are safe. We have safety at the forefront of everything that we do when we're running events. And it was not about testing the COVID passport. So that was not part of our agenda. And we were not saying, can event organisers run an event safely either? There'll be event organisers on this call who will also be very passionate about the fact that they know that in COVID, they can also run an event very safely because you've just got very robust risk assessments. So it was important to say we knew what we were doing, we knew what the event was about, we knew what the pilots were about, and we were also very clear about what it wasn't. We helped to organise 3 events. And when I say help to organise, the part that ACC Liverpool played is we hosted the Good Business Festival, but our ticketing provider, TQ, Ticket Quarter, also ran the ticketing for all of the 3 events. And we had the Good Business Festival, 2 events at a nightclub called Circus, and we also had the outdoor festival at Sefton Park, which was Festival Republic. There you can see the pictures of the crowds, and that was absolutely what it was about. To bring back an event in an indoor venue, a nightclub venue, and an outdoor quasi-indoor marquee venue in a park, to bring back crowds and to create as near to possible a realistic large-scale event where you could test what the transmission of COVID would look like. So it's really important to hang on to the fact that these were real events, they were not fabricated, they brought crowds together. Just to explain who was involved, I've already mentioned it on the first slide, but just to do a shout out for a number of people. The venue operators was obviously ourselves, and there was the Circus nightclub, and then there was also the people from Live Nation who set up Festival Republic in Sefton Park. The event promoters had a big part to play in this, and we also had a big part to play with public health, I've already mentioned, but really importantly, the local team from Liverpool City Council and Merseyside Police played a huge part in this to get this off the ground. Challenges were thick and fast. I'm sure Octavia and Rob will be nodding their head to say that it was very, very challenging. We did it because it was a really important line in the sand really for events and operators and organisers to try and help the government to understand what the data meant in terms of putting on live events in a pandemic. So we knew it was going to be challenging, and we did it with the best intentions, and we did it with a grin on our faces, but it was tough and it was really difficult at times. The most important part of it was the fact that we were working to a criteria, and we had to have people come to the event that could only live in the city region. And from anybody that knows Liverpool city region, it's quite vast, so it had to be postcode dependent. They had to be over 18, and they had to have a negative LFT test, which was a really important piece. Now that all seems fairly simplistic, but the most difficult part of that was to link that back to the ticketing process. And what we had to do was we had to get the ticketing system to talk to the people at GraphNet, who could then ensure that the person that bought a ticket, so I don't live in the city region, sadly I'm over 18 unfortunately, but if I was to try and buy a ticket with my postcode of where I live, the system should actually kick me out. So what we had to make sure was we had to test it over and over again to make sure that if you were not in the city region, you couldn't buy a ticket. If your date of birth didn't match and you then didn't have an LFT test that was negative, the system would actually kick you out. And if you can appreciate it, and if anyone's on this webinar that's an event organizer, that created a lot of uncertainty, because when we first did the matching for the Good Business Festival, we could only match to a very low level. The original match was about 40%, so we were losing 60% of people to attend. Now overnight and through a process of GraphNet working very, very diligently and testing the system over and over again, we eventually got a match of around about 95% for nearly all of the events. But for any event organizer out there, that causes a bit of a nervousness and butterflies in the stomach to think, if there's an attrition rate of 5% and you could lose on a 5,000 concert, 250 people, that's on the margins. But as soon as the attrition rate moves from 5% up to 10% and beyond, that attrition rate could cause some real problems for the event organizer. So data matching and the ticketing system was real challenge for us. Public health also had a real challenge because obviously what they were saying was you bring in 5,000 people into a space, or you bring in 3,000 people into a nightclub. From a public health point of view, they needed to be able to track those people if there was any positive tests that were emerging from prior to the event or post the event. So it was a real strong piece that public health had to be involved in that. It was heavily resource dependent, and it really needed a lot of co-joining between public health, GraphNet and Liverpool University. Communications and engagement was massive in terms of every ticketing, and I'll come on to the ticketing in a moment. We had to do around about 29 different points of communication to people pre and post the event actually happening. And the challenge for us was around the governance and the legals. There was a lot of legal conversations that had to happen, data matching agreements and data agreements between ourselves and DCMS, data agreements between GraphNet and DCMS, and so on and so forth. So it was complicated and it was uncharted territory. So we had to take it step by step in a very short time space. So yeah, there were a lot of challenges. What was also important is I put this slide in to say that all the way through, I just kept saying, I know it's a pilot, but please, please, please do not forget the customer experience. Octavia and Rob will bear me out on this, that we only get one chance of the customer to get it right. And if we get it wrong, they may remember that for the rest of time. And in the middle of the pandemic, what we didn't want to do was alienate 13,000 customers. Life is going to be tough enough when we come back to being live events and opening our doors. So we needed to make the customer experience as like a normal event as possible and not terrify the bejesus out of everybody. So when you were actually going and buying a ticket, we needed to make sure that people weren't thinking they were joining some sort of medical experiment. We needed to try and soften the language and make people feel that it was a pilot that they were helping and that we were trying to win their hearts and minds. And we were also making sure that we were trying to engage with them without making them feel as though they were going to be herded like lab rats into a system that was going to be quite intimidating. So making sure that we kept the customer at the front and centre of everything was really important to us as a venue and as the ticketing provider. Ticketing, I already mentioned, was a challenge. What was very difficult is it was one person, one ticket, which is quite unusual for us. We always sell multiple tickets to one purchaser. So if I wanted to go on and buy a ticket, I had to go onto the ticketing page, had to consent to join the pilot, and the consent terminology had to be legally written by the event research program. One ticket, one person, you had to fill in all of your details. Then you had to go on and fill out a university questionnaire, which was about how you felt. It was a very personalized questionnaire, which is about feelings, emotions. Did you feel safe? How you felt about being part of the pilot? Then you completed your ticket purchase. And then after that, your ticket was sitting there as a waiting ticket that was only activated and live and validated on the completion of a negative LFT test. So without a negative test, your ticket was not activated, it was voided. And that was obviously where we got into the issue of attrition. Data matching, I've already mentioned, was a challenge, and I've covered that in detail, but the big piece for us was to make sure the flow of information between the ticket purchase piece, the GraphNet, back to us to validate the ticket was absolutely tested and seamless. Because what we didn't want to do was to lose customers through that process that were kicked out of the system who actually were eligible to have a ticket. And what we experienced on the Good Business Festival was at that early stage, with it being the first of the pilots, there was about 30 people that GraphNet couldn't match. And when we went into the system, they were actually eligible for a ticket, so we had to override it. So as late in the stage of the pilots as the Good Business Festival, we were experiencing some real challenges with that data matching. It really was difficult. By the time it got to the circus events, the Friday and the Saturday night, it was absolutely fine. We'd sorted it all out. And actually for the Sefton Park event on the Sunday, it was working very, very efficiently. Testing was a real problem for us because if you can imagine, we had for the circus event on the Friday and the Saturday, there was 3,000 people attending each of those events. And then on the Sunday, there was 5,000 people attending the park event. So we had a big influx of people having to go through the main test centres in Liverpool for a lateral flow test. For clarification, there was nobody eligible to have a home test. You had to go to one of the official test centres in Liverpool. and the Liverpool test centres then had to staff up to make sure that they could cope with it. We also had to deploy the mobile test sites because not only were we having to do lateral flow tests for everybody that was attending the event as a customer, we also had to make sure that all of the staff and all of the crew for all of these events were also tested. So Liverpool City Council fortuitously have got lots of mobile testing units, and they deployed them across the city to help with the management of the lateral flow testing for the staff and the crew in support of these events, which the numbers were running into, nearly 1,000 people across the city. What was also really difficult for us is we were co-joining with the university in Liverpool for the research programme. And we recognised that quite a number of our customers were coming from the student population, but because of the legal relationship between the test centres, we were not allowed to access the university test sites. They were only eligible to test students. They weren't allowed to test members of the public. So if a student who was at Liverpool University was coming to one of our events, they were technically not allowed to use their test centres, which put an enormous amount of pressure again on our ability to lateral flow test in that time period, which was a hurdle that we had to overcome. Event organisation was in the main normal, but there was some extra challenges thrown in for good measure. And a big piece that was a challenge to us, which I know is a hot potato in the industry, is the insurance piece. Our insurers notified us that we were not insurable for public liability for this event because it was a pilot. And that was not an unusual piece. That was something that everybody across the events industry will be experiencing. If you wanted to open the doors in a pandemic outside of the government regs, you're not insured. So we had to put that insurance liability onto the the shoulders of the promoter. So that was a big piece that came to us about 2 weeks before the first event of the Good Business Festival. So despite the fact that the Government Secretary Oliver Dowden was going to underwrite the insurance in a letter, he couldn't give us any solid enough assurances that we would be covered. So that insurance had to sit, and that liability had to sit on the shoulders of the event promoter for the Good Business Festival. There was a lot of legal contract work that we had to go through to get the event up and off the ground. There was costs that we incurred, which as a city council venue, we agreed to actually bear those costs, but it was not without its responsibility to undertake a lot of cost that we couldn't claim back from the government. There was a challenge around ventilation, and I know that there was a question that was raised through the AEV about what happened with ventilation. And we had Loughborough University who attended the site as part of the ERP programme to actually look at our ventilation and to plan how we were going to ventilate the Good Business Festival. Now for the circus events, they had a ventilation plan again with Loughborough University, and for the outdoor festival, it was in a marquee. So they just opened the side flaps of the marquee, so ventilation was not so much a challenge. There was a debate around whether we were allowed to have alcohol or not. And what we said is without alcohol, the events will be absolutely dire and dreadful. Do not try and do a nightclub event without a glass of wine, a can of lager or whatever else. It had to be an alcohol event for all of them, because without it, it would have just been a big flop. Transport was a challenge because there was an issue around how people were actually going to get to the event. What we said is you cannot expect people to not be able to jump in taxis and use public transport because these are alcohol events. So we had to have a dispensation that people were allowed to get to the events by any means possible. I'm just going to move mine. Yeah, social distancing was an important piece. Just to explain quickly, the challenge we had with particularly the nightclub events was that you had 3,000 people going to be queuing to get into the nightclub. They had to be socially distanced, they had to wear a mask, so they had to be 2 meters apart as they queued to get into that event. As they stepped over the threshold of that event, they went into non-COVID world. Then they came out of the nightclub, they then had to go straight back into the COVID world. So the stewarding program and ingress had to be really quite cleverly managed. And in terms of managing large crowds of 5,000 people, 3,000 people who are full of alcohol, had an amazing time, to then bring them back as they cross the threshold on egress from a non-COVID world back into COVID world was a challenge, and there was a lot of stewarding and a lot of comms had to happen around that. It was a particular challenge for the police as well. They were quite worried about it, and it meant that we had to spend a lot of time working through the risk assessment program with the SAG in Liverpool. It all worked out fine and it was all great, and it was absolutely event free. There was no issues on the egress, but it was a factor that absolutely did bend our heads at the beginning of the planning process. How are you going to manage the behaviours and the mindset of people going in and out of COVID and non-COVID worlds? I mentioned age again. There was a challenge around age. There was a lot of people trying to fake to get into the events to try and prove that they were 18, particularly for the nightclub. And that became an issue in terms of the attrition rate for people that were getting kicked out of the system. So it was just to explain that. So communications and engagement. Big piece of this was around how much texting, SMSing, social media and emailing we had to do. I mentioned that on average, we sent out per ticket purchase 29 pieces of contact to try and keep them engaged. And the biggest challenge was about the lateral flow test prior to the event, and importantly, the PCR test after. The PCR test after the event was not compulsory, and that was a real difficulty. So we spent a lot of money sending SMSs out to people to try and engage with them to make sure that they were going for their PCR test afterwards. And the take up on the PCR tests for the circus and the nightclub events, the circus event and the Sefton Park event, eventually was at a relatively healthy rate in comparison to other pilots. But that was just purely to do with the amount of texting, emailing, and actually the public health team starting to ring people who hadn't done a PCR test. So it was very labour intensive. Governance. I mentioned about governance earlier about the insurance side of it. We had to set up a data sharing agreement. We had to do a lot of work with the licensing, Merseyside Police, Fire and Ambulance and Public Health. And we also were very heavily dependent on the event being given approval 48 hours before by the Gold Command. That was obviously very strongly linked to the public health team in Liverpool. So it was not a straightforward process. We could not make any assumptions that the pilot was actually going to happen because it was all about the data. So had there been an absolute spike in problems of infection in Liverpool, it could have been that the pilot may not have happened. As it was, we were at that stage, we were at very low levels of infection rates in Liverpool, so the event was allowed to proceed. So just to give you some data here, this is the information from Ian Buchan from the University of Liverpool. So pre-event, there was 5 positive LFT results identified through the testing process. Post-event, there was 4 positive PCR results. And then the 8 positive results were identified after the event, but they couldn't identify that they'd actually caught it from the event. They could have caught it from the 5 or 6 days or 7 days after the event where they were just going about their normal business. But in terms of the information, that was incredibly beneficial to the management of public health in Liverpool. And this data was really useful for the public health team to understand what were those 4 people doing who got the results. Did they live together? What did they do straight afterwards? How did they manage their clusters? And from the work that public health team have shared with us, that they had a real concerted effort to make sure that the limitation of those positive results didn't then spread and infect in their local community. So just some points below that, you can all read, you don't need me to read them all out, but it was about a significant reliance on the links between ticketing and the test data and the verification of the lateral flow testing. There was a big reliance on the public health team to intervene. We also experienced a lot of people who tried to get a negative result from an LFT once they'd had a positive. So they were running around different sites to try and get a second, a third and a fourth negative LFT because they so desperately wanted to get to the event. And we also had to do a lot of work around trying to stop people fraudulently entering the circus event and the nightclub event. They were so massively attractive to that age population. They were around about 18 to 30-year-old. They hadn't had a night out in forever. They were desperate to go. So if people were getting a negative test or they hadn't got a test, they were trying to do a bit of fake LFT verification information passing between text messages. So they were trying to get a friend to go for a test to use it and fraudulently enter the venue or the event. So the stewarding on that side of it had to be absolutely on the money and really quite diligent. So that's the PCR testing information that I can share. And the final point is, it was a fantastic set of events. It was really well received by the people of Liverpool, and it demonstrated that the events were run safe, they were risk managed, they were delivered safely, and the people who actually participated in it thought it was fantastic. We were really proud to be involved in it, and as you can see there, I think a picture tells 1,000 words. That's the delight and joy that live events brings to the general population. Long may we long may it continue that we all feel that we can deliver safe events. It's fantastic, and we just want to get back to business. I think I'll end on that point, Rachel.
Fantastic, Kerry. Thank you so much for the fantastic insight into the few weeks of very, very intense work and up in Liverpool. So and obviously the very, very positive results that they had. So thank you for that. I'm now going to move to Octavia. So if you're happy to share your screen now, and Octavia's going to talk to you about the BRIT Awards. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Kerry. That was great. And it leads on quite nicely to what I've set up on this deck. I'm not going to go into too much detail in regards to the comms and the insurances and the details of the ticketing and stuff, and focus more on the operation on the ground that we had to deliver. So for those of you that you know, are aware of what happened at the Brits, just to summarise, the measures that we put in place for the Brits were an agreement between the DCMS, BPI and AEG. It wasn't something that was dictated in regards to the aspects that were COVID non-compliant anymore, and the disapplication of the rules in the venue. So we had that attendees did not need to socially distance once you came into the footprint of the O2. The disapplication took place at the front doors of the O2. Face coverings were to be maintained in all communal areas, but were able to be removed when guests were in their seats or their suites. And staff and attendees were required to produce the negative lateral flow tests on arrival in order to enter the footprint of the arena. So the one thing that was quite a hard thing for us to get to the real detail of how the two areas kind of crossed was that staff were not part of the ERP. But our front of house staff were next to 4,500 people that were. So staff were required to continue wearing face coverings at all times in front of house areas, and the social distancing in place was not applicable to staff because they were within those public areas. That then linked into the few production who were back of house also coming into front of house areas. All attendees did complete the consent form at the time of application for the tickets. So to summarise who was where, we had a capacity agreed of 4,500 people. Our standard attendance for the Brits is around the 16,000, 17,000. The arena floor was the full production, and instead of having 100+ tables of industry folk having a wonderful time, it was just nominees on socially distanced bubbled tables. So for those of you that did watch it, it was significantly less because all the production and the artists were still under the COVID regulations and still had to minimize all their movements and stay within their bubbles. Level 1 was for key workers only. And I think the real significant difference that we experienced with our guests being level 2 and 3 music industry as well is they weren't average public attendance. So people couldn't just apply to come to the show. And therefore with music industry people just desperate to get our venues back open and shows back happening, and then the key workers, it was such a compliant crowd to the mass comms that Kerry explained about that went out to all the customers. People really paid attention. They wanted to do the best that they could do to make sure the event happened in the best way possible as well. So similar to the Liverpool operations, in order to get through, customers had to prove that negative lateral flow test at the main doors. We had 2 separate queues out on Peninsula Square, which was the social distance full COVID regulations in place. And then because of the complexities of our site, which I will go into a little bit more on the next slide, is we actually had a secondary spot check of the negative test at the arena entrance as well, because we have an avenue of shops and restaurants. When we did a sweep of the site, because the operation outside of the arena was still happening, we did that secondary test just in case someone slipped through the net and came through the front doors to go to the shops or a restaurant prior to coming into the arena. The main considerations and learnings on this point is the space available, as Kerry highlighted. When we still have mitigations in place, primarily in regards to social distancing, the space that every venue has external to your footprint to queue people socially distanced to process high numbers of people is very complicated, depending on who owns what land. You know, there are venues that go straight onto a busy road, and we were lucky with the capacity that we had. We were very confident with the space that we had outside. If that capacity increases with the mitigation still in place, it becomes very problematic very quickly. So increasing the capacity isn't about operating it in the arena and operating your F&B and your stewards and your search processes at the arena entrance. It is possibly not achievable to increase the capacity with the current mitigations that we're all working towards. So the lateral flow test to gain entry, the one thing that, learning from Kerry, we hoped to have in place was that communication piece between the negative test and your ticket being valid. Unfortunately for us, the technology didn't happen quick enough. So a few weeks prior to the event, we realized that your ticket would be valid, irrelevant of the lateral flow test even being taken, let alone being negative. So everyone was told to go to an in-person ATS. It had to be in person because everyone in this call is aware that the test at home situation, there is an element of fraud that is possible. The risk is there for someone to just scan the code, not even take the test. Or as Kerry was saying, people fraudulently trying to get other people to take tests on their behalf, and you get the text message. So the comms was very, very clear in order for people to do the right thing. And also, as I mentioned, the crowd coming in, they're not the crowd who would do that. They want this to work so desperately, same as us, that we felt this risk was low enough. What we did do is we asked for an on-site testing operation, just a small one for the few that battery ran out, they've lost their text or whatever it is. But we were told that DCMS and Trivandi would not operate that. They would not provide us any on-site testing facility. So we have a great relationship with Charlton Athletic locally. They provide our workplace testing. So they were very helpful and they provided us some on-site testing, which we did not advertise to anyone coming. And thankfully, we only had a very, very small number of people requiring it. But it was something that we thought was really important that we had to have on site. Because if you sent someone 45 minutes down the road to get a test and then wait for the result and come back, you'd miss the show. So we wanted to make sure that the customer experience on that was as best as we could provide. The PCR test was sent out in advance and after the event, same as Liverpool, but that was not operated by us. And the PCR pre-test didn't have any impact on the test in order to gain access into the event. As I mentioned, face coverings, there were different rules for staff and customers. The one thing that we did notice, and we were quite relaxed upon, was the fact that the excitement of people coming in, which was wonderful to see, and people hugging each other and, you know, seeing people that they hadn't seen for over a year was wonderful. And then especially after a while, when they're in the communal areas, the face coverings were not worn by the majority of people. There was no social distancing in place. And as I mentioned, the Icon trading hours, our shopping district, they ceased trading at 6 o'clock, which was when our doors opened. So we did a sweep of the site at 5:30 in order to ensure that people left the site, didn't get you know, crossed over with the BRIT attendees, and therefore we were able to be comfortable and confident that we had tested everyone's negative result before coming in. So with staff not being part of the ARP, that meant that DCMS and Trivandi offered us no support in regards to providing testing for about 800 front of house staff. We thought that, you know, this was something so important. We reached out to Greenwich Council and they were excellent in providing us a large number of test at home kits. So every single staff member had to come to BRIT's pre-training in order to be eligible to work the show. So at that training, we taught them how to do a test at home kit, we taught them how to register it, and we gave them a packet each. There are also a number of suppliers who are working at ATSs and are working in the environments anyway. So staff did have the option of test at home or on-site testings, as long as they had the same 36 hours negative tests on arrival for the event shift. We honoured either option. The back of house staff, like always, would be within the BRIT's accreditation scheme. And that was a digitally managed accreditation. So when you came on site, you were scanned at any access point to the arena. If you went green, you could go in for your shift and carry on working. If you went red, that meant that your negative test was out of date. Every 3 days we were tested. And there was only one place with one door that you could go into in order to go through that testing process, which reduced any cross-contamination of people that might be slightly out of date of having a negative result. This was the operation. Again, we're lucky in the fact that we have this space which we call the quadrant. For those of you that know the site, it's just to the left-hand side of our main doors in between the tube. And it's a large piece of concrete with walls surrounding it. So it's very helpful for us in order to have these kind of spaces for these kind of unique events. But long term, if we didn't have that, for example, if another event was using the space, the availability to provide this back of house testing would be very complicated. The Brits were based in the hotel next door to us. So it's the kind of thing that it might be a longer process for all venue staff to divert to the hotel, for example, in order to come in on site. That just increases your hours of working, your processes, etc. So the entry point at the main doors, you go through the hand wash, the search regime, so the security was covered at every single access point, irrelevant of which entrance you were coming into the arena. And then it allowed a decent space for a lot of people to be able to be processed at the same time for the testing, wait for your result, then go via accreditation in order to gain access to the site. On arrivals, Kerry mentioned the kind of difference between, you know, if people are drinking, less vehicles, personal vehicles being driven in. You know, we have a very, very good tube network right on our doorstep. Our bus network is excellent. We have boats, we have Emirates Airline. But some research we did last year was that we would expect about 20% increase on driving to the venue. Linking that to my previous comment about capacity, that's fine for us to handle that amount of cars for a lower capacity, the percentage of cars. But if we start sticking with that percentage of people driving and increase our capacity, we then run out of capacity. So there's various areas that increase of capacity really does directly impact until the return to normal begins and more people are more comfortable and confident going on the tubes and the buses and the boats. So just to summarise those that don't know the site all that well, we're a big round tent and our main doors is in between the blue and the pink dots, and our main entrance B, and then entrance H is around the other side of the shopping district and avenue. So we had 2 different queuing systems for the key workers on level 1 and then the suite industry guests. And this is basically just to limit any crossing of big groups of people, just to keep it as simple and clear as possible. So people go through that queuing process, they get that negative test result and ID check done, and then they just go straight through to their entrances. The suite guests went straight through our suite and VIP lanes and they went upstairs. And then the level 1 would go into our main entrances and then had the opportunity as queues build to reduce any dense queues and congestion of people, we spread it over to our second entrance as well. Egress was something that was a big thing for us, especially to manage the expectations and facilities of the tube station. We split the egress. We could have easily pushed everyone through entrance B, but we you know, sent a lot of people the long way round in order to stagger that queue, because as Kerry mentioned, the minute you go out of that door, social distancing now comes into play and all COVID rules come back into play. We had a lot of space on site. We put pulse points in around the avenue if needed. we could non-socially distance queue people inside. So we could really handle a lot of people split into these 4 routes, so that instead of putting the pressure outside and trying to manage this excitable crowd to tell them to go back to social distancing, we were able to have that space inside. Suites closed an hour later as well, so that again, that staggered the impact as people were leaving. So just to quickly summarize, I know we're running a bit late. So here are some main headlines from a questionnaire we did. We actually had a really high number of people responding to the questionnaire, which shows that people really wanted to say that it was good, they felt safe, they felt comfortable, they'd do it again. So, you know, people were actively trying to use the app to do food and beverage purchasing instead of going, you know, old school up to the till. People saw the COVID measures in place, they saw the cleaning, they felt safe, and all the comms seemed to work. So it's really nice to kind of have that reassurance at the end that not only were we thrilled with the event, but by all accounts, let's say 98% of the attendees were thrilled too. Thanks, Rachel.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Octavia. That's brilliant. So right, I'm going to quickly move on to Rob now as well. So Rob, over to you to share your screen.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So I'm Rob Brumell. I'm the Head of Event Management at Farnborough International, and I'm going to talk through the operation that took place at the event production show. So just a little bit about the show. It was held on the 26th and 27th of May in our main hall, Hall 1 at Farnborough International. It had the show capacity of 1,000, so this wasn't a test event. So we had to adhere to the regulations of the capacity, but that obviously didn't include exhibitors, our own venue staff and suppliers that were on site. We monitored that through a clicking system in and out of the venue. There was one entrance in and one entrance out, which allowed us to monitor that throughout the day to ensure that we didn't go over that limit. And also the spacing out of the event, the majority of the aisles were 4 meters, which made it feel very nice and open, which made everybody feel nice and relaxed, which was very positive. Just talking through how we worked with the local authority. It was a mass media event, and we're working very closely with Matt Lambert and the team at Maelstrom as well. And what was really important from our point of view was the clear communication that we were having leading up to the event. As we all know, things were changing quite dynamically, and I'll go on to some of those that were happening nearer to the start of the event. But just to outline some of the areas that we were differing from Octavia and Kerry, what they were saying in terms of their events, we weren't testing the guests before they were entering the venue. We were doing lateral flow tests on our own teams and the venue team as well, which was a decision that we took just to support them in working at the venue. There weren't also temperature checks that took place as people entered the venue, and they were scanned in and out through the ticketing and registration system that was led for the event, so that there was a track and trace system through the venue, and then separately to that in the catering areas, which I'll go into a bit more detail in a second. In terms of the track and trace, we did use the NHS track and trace and asked people to scan in and that as well through the entranceway and in the catering areas. And we also had the communication that went out through the organisers to guests on protocol of if you were feeling ill and not coming to the venue as a starting point. And also the pre-registration was also encouraged just to speed up that flow through into the event when they arrived. Masks were worn throughout. Obviously in the catering areas, they were not worn. So that certainly was supported by most people. And then with the alcohol service that did take place throughout the event, there were periods when there were certain reminders that were needed when stepping off of the catering areas that you needed to put your mask on, which was inevitable as well. Just in terms of the build and breakdown process, so as well as signing onto the CDM site, they were also signing a COVID declaration as well. So that was really the main touch point for those people pre and post event, making sure that, that the venue was safe outside of the people who were actually attending it. In terms of the theatre areas then, you can see there that they were socially distanced, and there are also headsets being worn during those sessions in those couple of arena areas, and they were sanitised between each use. And there was also patrols that went on throughout the venue with our own security team, and also supported by EEP as well, just ensuring people wearing masks and adhering to social distancing through the aisles. From our point of view, bits that we supported as part of the show, we did have hand sanitizers through all of the areas that were communal and also into the toilet facilities. We benefit from open plan toilet door areas, so there's no touch points going into the male and female toilets, which obviously supports us in terms of touch points for cleaning. We highlighted alternate sinks, urinals, hand dryers to ensure that we're spacing people out during the use, but all the cubicles were in use throughout all of the toilets that were open. Each set of toilets had a toilet attendant as well that was there constantly cleaning those, just to support any touch points that were around there, and also the facilities themselves in between use. Just talking then about how things changed dynamically. So a week out, as we all know, there was a directive from the DCMS around track and trace in the catering areas. So we had to look at those in terms of how we were managing people getting into those areas and coming back out of them. So just highlighting there 180 metres of barrier that we needed overnight to 10 SATA barriers to cordon those off. So big thank you to Thorns Group for supporting us on that one. But that was just to ensure that there was a process of people scanning in through the track and trace, and they weren't just wandering onto the area and having that crossover. In terms of the seating area, there was a maximum, as there are in restaurants, of 6 people per table, and they had QR codes that they could utilise for alcohol service being taken to their seats. So there was no alcohol service that was done in a standing area or people moving around with that either. So just a few bits that the local authority did go into a bit more depth with us. So we obviously issued a COVID risk assessment to them in terms of the event that we worked on with Maelstrom, and made sure that that was coherent between ourselves as a venue and them as an organiser. And that then came through with a few bits. There was one area where we had some alcohol sampling, which we put a queuing system into, and the sampling actually took place in situ at the front by the stand, and no one could walk away with that alcohol service. So that was an interesting one to deal with the local authority. There was a mobile massage team that brought into one of the stands. And this was an area that the local authority had a bit more of an understanding, because they dealt with it in other areas within the borough. So they wanted us to adhere to hairdressing regulations of a mask and a screen shield at all times. So just a bit more of their knowledge that, that was being pushed upon us. And we also had our AHO come on the first day of the live day. And it was really positive that they felt comfortable. They weren't here very long, they were maybe here 10, 15 minutes. And the support that they gave us was very positive. The only thing that they picked up on was that there was multiple wipes taking place on different headsets in some of the arena areas, which out of everything that we were doing, we were quite positive that that could be rectified very quickly. So that gave us the ability that for ongoing events, they're entrusting that what we're saying we're going to be doing is actually being followed through. And then just finally, just some initial feedback that we've already had through. So we've been rated 9.24 out of 10 for feeling safe, which was really positive. 88% people feeling that the signage was sufficient around COVID. And 100% said that social distancing was observed. So as I say, the only key thing was really highlighting to people as they came off the catering area, they may forget to put their mask back on, but apart from that, everybody was doing as they were told, which was really positive. So thank you very much, Rachel.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you so much. And thank you to all three of you. Amazing insights and all sort of very similar experiences, but all very different in their own way as well. So we've now got, we've got 8 minutes then for some questions. And there are some that we've prepared earlier. We've checked to see if there's any more, but I'm going to just pose one question to all three of you initially. I don't know who wants to answer it, but what are the two major takeaways that you would, from your event, that you would inform our audience of? Who wants to go first? Octavia, we'll get a pick on you.
Okay, I'll go first, that's fine. I think the two main points for us as the industry, I touched on it in my bit, is the difference between the capacity increases and the reduction of mitigations that we need to put in place for COVID rules. It just doesn't work as we go up. Things do need to change in order to make our capacities achievable. And as Kerry touched on, you know, the profit margin is in that last percentage of sales. So it becomes a very big financial impact for the venue and the promoter and suppliers, and everyone's doing anything that they can in order to reduce costs or do things at cost. And so no one makes any money. So especially when you're looking at the amount of time that you need to put into the event, because the load-ins are longer, the queuing's longer, the process is longer, therefore the hours you pay for staff are longer. So I think those two are the key things that we really need to kind of knuckle down on, what the when the rules and mitigations start releasing, how that actually works for us on the ground as to what we can then deliver.
Great, thank you, Octavia. Those are very valid points. Kerry.
The takeaway from me was a big tick in the box, is that we proved to the government that as an event venue and across the events in Liverpool, representing the events industry, the way we deliver, the events industry delivers, is about safety. We risk assess, we are methodical, we are absolutely paranoid about public, customer safety and security. So with our eyes closed, that's in our DNA, it's absolutely what we do. And when we were talking to the ERP and the government, every single opportunity I could have to say, forget the pilot, this is what we do. We are absolutely able to switch back on in the industry. We can operate COVID safe, we can operate events because we do it safely, we do it with risk assessment, we do it diligently. It's not a new phenomenon to us. Pandemic has rocked the world, but the industry can step back in and be active and live because it's what we do. And we're very equipped and able to do it, and across every sector. And when we talk to the event organisers and we talk to the DCMS with the event organisers, we were hand in glove, all talking the same language. Customers have to be safe, staff have to be safe, we can do this safely.
Yeah, very well said. And Rob, you got.
Yeah, I would say what's really impressed me across the industry is how everybody's pulled together as well. I think that how we can support each other. We want events to work from a venue's point of view as much as an organisers, and clear communication has been paramount in understanding what no one's been through before. So the fact that we're working together to get the same result, which is for events to be back up and running, I think has been key and really positive through this process, as much as you can take positivity out of it. But also, I think when you're planning floor plans, we obviously had the ability in our event that we had a smaller area to build out into if we needed to, with catering areas. But I think going forward that could be something that is going to impact if we do need to do this for a longer period of time, in terms of that queuing element and also the ability to seat people, because keeping them socially distanced in an environment where they haven't got a mask on is challenging. So hopefully that does go away very soon.
Yeah, and just on that then, because your event, Rob, you did have to wear face masks. Obviously, it's still in step 3, and coming into step 4, when we come into step 4, we still don't know whether we're going to have certain mitigations placed on us. But did you have issues with people keeping their face masks on? I know you mentioned about with going onto the catering area, and obviously then they're supposed to put them back on, but generally walking around, were people compliant keeping their face masks on? Was that an area of concern?
Yeah, and generally that people did did keep them on. Inevitably, for those people like the exhibitors who are there all day and the teams from the venue point of view, you are wearing that for a long period of time. So for our team, we just made sure that we gave enough masks to be able to change them over during the course of the day, so you kind of felt like you had a fresh mask on. And it's probably the same for the exhibitors as well. So their ability to kind of go for a breather in the catering area does help that. But no one was really kind of being malicious or anything and not wanting to wear a mask. So, yeah.
And I guess for Kerry and Octavia, you know, for you, it was with face masks, obviously, once alcohol did get consumed, it was a very different experience. So, and I guess that's one that everybody's just going to have to think about, isn't it? If that is one of the mitigations. So, we talked about, you've obviously talked about certain measures that you have put in. Are there any measures, specific measures that mitigation measures that you did implement that you'd continue to do once we're allowed to be fully open? Kerry.
We were open in December, so we were operating in tier 2. So we had lots of events in December, fortuitously, because Liverpool was in that different tier. So we ran events in tier 2 as it was. So there was nothing different that we would introduce from following the pilot. I think what it did show is that, as Octavia said, it's incredibly hard to run an event with people separated with masks on. And when you do add alcohol to it, it does change things. I think the issue that we've got now is post-pilot is what's going to happen. How is the government going to link lateral flow testing or home testing with an event? And are they going to do that? Because we're hoping not. We're hoping that we can just open. So we're just bracing ourselves. So I think it's going to absolutely depend on the measures and the restrictions the government introduced, Rachel. And we're all just sitting here waiting. And whatever comes out, we just got to try and work with and adapt. And I think across the sector, everyone's shown how agile everybody is. We can just adapt and change it. It's not great. And I think once it hits the bottom line, that's where we've got an issue, because promoters and event organisers are not going to deliver an event if they're not going to make any money and they're going to be at risk. So I think that's the challenge.
You've just about answered sort of the next question I was going to ask, but I might just pose that one to you anyway. Octavia, is if the guidance does, if the government do insist on CSC, COVID status certification, which you know as an industry we have said that we will support in the short term, that is, let's make that clear, it's not in the long term. I mean, what do you think those major challenges will be?
I think there's kind of like twofold of it. You know, Kerry was lucky in the fact that the identification of the negative was directly linked to the validity of your ticket. I think that's really key, because depending on your demographic coming in, you either have an incredibly high risk of fraud or a fairly low risk of fraud, and therefore with your risk assessment for the event and how you kind of manage that will massively vary. The kind of second part of the digital connection to it is the fact that you can only probably really have one ticket agent, which is obviously another financial impact to promoters if we're insisting that 100% of the manifest must be sold through the venue's ticketing app in order to have that link. So I think it kind of depends on how strict and what specific measures that program looks like. And then each venue is going to have to adapt differently technologically, and therefore how many more boots on the ground you need in order to do those checks and where you do them, whether it's external, whether it's like an ID check at the point of your ticket being scanned. It's so variable to every venue. And I think, you know, as Kerry said, we're just sitting ducks waiting to be told some things, and then we'll all just adapt the best way we can, that we can then hopefully financially make it work.
Absolutely. So I have got a couple more questions, but I think we're out of time. It's 11:31, so, and I'm conscious I can see people are starting to leave now. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. So all of you, you've done an amazing job. Thank you so much. And we're working hard. We're fighting hard to try and get some more insight into step 4, when that's going to come, what, if there are going to be any mitigation, any measures that we're going to have to put in place. So you know that as associations, we will be the first ones to let you know if we hear anything. But thank you all for insightful, informative and really interesting presentations. And thank you to all of our delegates and guests that joined us today as well. So see you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Yes, bye-bye.